Hi everyone. Let me start by extending my warm welcome to all of you today, especially those of you who have come from other countries and distant locations in the US. My name is Balakrishnan Rajagopal, and I'm a professor of law and development at MIT at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and also the founder of the Displacement Research and Action Network, the program on human rights at MIT. I'm happy to welcome you to the opening plenary of the conference today on property from below, which will continue tomorrow as well in the Vanilla Bush room. I'll be brief and make a few remarks explaining the displacement network at MIT, this conference and the structure of events for the day. The displacement network is a network launched in 2012, consisting of academics from MIT and several area universities such as Harvard and Northeastern, as well as NYU, activists, major social movement networks and NGOs such as Economic and Social Rights Net and Housing and Land Rights Network, as well as policy and law-focused organizations such as the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. For further information, please visit our website, displacement@mit.edu. We have a Facebook page also that you can click on there. It's Displacement Research and Action Network, MIT Displacement Research and Action Network. Our purpose is to contest the inevitability of evictions and displacement and to work towards lessening their occurrence and severity. Forced evictions and loss of land are occurring at a faster rate than ever before around the world due to many reasons, whether due to conflict and war, disasters and climate change, or development projects and policies. Our network's focus is more on the last, forced displacement due to development projects and policies, which is leading to staggering numbers of displaced people, more than 250 million in just the last 2 decades by one estimate, and is resulting in increasing poverty, social exclusion, negative impacts on indigenous people, farmers, rural and urban poor, children, women, and devastating impacts on health, food, and livelihood security. It's a major human rights and development crisis. Despite the high incidence of displacement, particularly resulting from development and market-led processes, we know very little about displaced people. We lack robust data on the numbers of people displaced, where they end up, what happens to the land where they were living, conditions they face post-displacement, and what resettlement, rehabilitation, or restitution opportunities are actually available to them. Our objective is to contribute through research and action-oriented practical engagement to better knowledge and hopefully to better outcomes. This conference is the first major research initiative of the Displacement Network. In this, we want to take on the growing commodification of property rights in and over land and associated natural resources. At its root, displacement is about the loss of land and place, and the justifications for and the mechanisms used for displacement of poor people from their land are ultimately based on theories of property rights. We want to examine these theories critically and to propose alternatives to them, which is essential for a new epistemic reframing of the displacement debate. With me today is my friend and colleague, Professor Olivier DeSchutter, from the University of Louvain in Belgium, who is also the current UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, a distinguished scholar activist of international law, and a leading global voice on land grabs and its impact on the world's poor, including on food security. This conference is a result of us joining our efforts together through our mutual research centers. He will further explain, after me, the intellectual logic behind the conference and anticipate some of the themes that will be discussed during the plenary today and tomorrow. I would like to close by thanking many who have made this conference possible. First of all, Olivier and his team from Belgium, Anne Ansem and Priscilla Claes, the MISTI program at MIT, my department, Urban Studies and Planning, which has been a generous supporter of this conference. Our department head, Iran Ben Joseph, is not well today, so cannot join us, but warmly welcomes you all to MIT. The Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School, the incredible team led by Alpen Sheth, with Devin and Claire and On the other, a doctoral student in my department, Alpenship, has played a central role in organizing this conference. Without all these efforts, the conference would not have been possible. Now let me turn it over to Olivier. Following his remarks, we'll immediately start with the plenary panel at 4:30 p.m. The panel will close at 6:25 or so, and we'll have a reception outside until about 7:15. Once again, my warm welcome to all of you.
Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to welcome you. Thank you, Raj, for this introduction. My name is Olivier DeSchutter. I'm the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Right to Food, and very delighted that we can cooperate in organizing this event. Let me say a few words to explain where this comes from and what our hopes are for this two-day symposium. We know that as a result of a number of developments in recent years, pressures on land have been increasing significantly, including the food price crisis, the pressure to produce and consume more agrofuels, carbon credits that have made land into a valuable asset for carbon mitigation strategies, and speculation on farmland that are fueled by the financialization of the agricultural commodities markets. All this has contributed to this very impressive pressure on land, pricing out, in many cases, the poor communities without deeds that recognize their ownership over land out of these developing land markets. So to a certain extent, this seems like a repetition of what we had in the decade of tightening, roughly between 1993 2005. There was already much talk about tightening at the time, but I would like to emphasize the differences between what we are seeing now and what was occurring at the time. In the 1990s, when the World Bank was promoting tightening as a sort of panacea for many development problems, particularly in a report of 1993 called Housing Enabling Markets to Work, insisting on the need to register property and to title the property of urban dwellers, the idea was really to allow people who are using land, who are squatting property, to mortgage the land and to become entrepreneurs in order to join as economic agents the markets. And this idea was, of course, implemented very spectacularly by the Institute for Liberty and Democracy of Hernando de Soto in Peru in 1998. Hernando de Soto published his book, The Mystery of Capital, in 2000, that was very much advocating for this approach. And for many years, this was what was the main purpose of tightening. It was to empower people, to allow them to become entrepreneurs, to give them access to the capital markets, and to encourage them to be productive agents. 10 years after this movement was launched, there was a sudden backlash against this idea, and I would like to take as a reference point to describe this change of mindset, if you wish, the work of the United Nations High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor. Now, this was a commission established in 2005. It delivered its final report in June 2008. It was co-chaired, this commission, by Hernando de Soto and Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State for President Clinton. And in this report, which was meant to validate Hernando de Soto's views, in fact, the High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor arrived at very disturbing conclusions, disturbing at least for one of the co-chairs, Hernando de Soto. What did the Commission say about tightening? It said essentially three things. First, it found that in many cases there had been elite capture. In other terms, tightening was particularly benefiting the best informed, those knowing that a tightening program would be launched and preemptively buying off land at slightly higher than the prices set in the informal markets, and basically capturing the process because of their political links and because of their access to capital. That was the first problem that tightening schemes encountered that the Commission documented. Secondly, the UN High-Level Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor noted that the collective rights on commons and the customary forms of tenure had been undermined by tightening schemes, sometimes increasing the legal insecurity linked to the fact that tightening superimposed a new legal system, a new definition of rights over land over and above customary forms of tenure, which they found was problematic in many cases, particularly since customary forms of tenure were actually quite flexible, robust, and legitimate in the eyes of many communities. And thirdly, the Commission noted that in many cases, tightening schemes led to more land concentration. Essentially because even when the deeds went to the poor land users, it was not unusual for them to then borrow based on having mortgaged their land, making the wrong investments, making the wrong choices, borrowing at too high interest rates, and ultimately being dispossessed from the land that they had mortgaged. In other cases, they were victims of speculation. They were priced out of land markets, and the little land that they had, they could not expand, and they were not competitive enough on markets that rewarded economies of scale. And in yet other situations, they just sold off land, benefiting from a sort of windfall effect as prices suddenly rose as a result of tightening schemes being implemented, but they had no alternative livelihood options for the long term, and so they were ultimately excluded as a result. So that was the report of 2008, and tightening was suddenly seen less than before as the magic bullet. But then what happened is that a new justification was found for the commodification of land rights and of natural resources in general that was really more linked to what Ronald Coase had developed concerning the efficiency or the benefits from the point of view of allocative efficiency of developing markets in land rights than it had to do with Hernando de Soto's ideas. And this second wave of tightening was premised on the view that resources had to be used for the benefit of the community, for the benefit of all. It was not right to have resources unexploited, left idle, underutilized, because in times of scarcity, as the planet was increasingly under pressure, it had to deliver for the benefit of all. And it's very striking to me that the kind of rhetorics that emerged then is very similar to the one that was used in the colonial period to justify in the 16th, 17th centuries in the work of, for example, Francis de Vitoria, to justify colonialism as a means to ensure that the resources that the natives were occupying would be effectively used for the benefit of all the world. It was not right to leave underutilized natural resources that could be much better exploited for the benefit of all. And today, farmers are being commercialized just like in the past, natives were being civilized. When I read, for example, what Tony Angie has been writing in his book Imperialism, Sovereignty and the Making of International Law, there are very striking analogies between what happened back then to justify imperialism to what is happening today. And I think the paper of Philip McMichael is very explicit in this regard. Secondly, the context has changed. Today we have a global market for land rights, and indeed also for water rights and for genetic resources that has been developing. And the implication of this global market developing is that the competition has increased between populations with widely diverging purchasing powers. Populations in the affluent west or north can capture the resources that populations in the global south are unable to command control over because their purchasing power simply does not match those of wealthy consumers in OECD countries. And if we look at, for example, the development of agri-fuels production, or the huge surfaces of land that are used today to produce soybean to feed cattle and satisfy our taste for meat in affluent societies, I think it boils down to this development of global markets with a competition increasing between populations with extremely divergent purchasing powers. And this leads to a situation in which our runaway consumption in the West, our affluent lifestyles are not being questioned at the same time that the pressure on resources in the global South is increasingly under pressure. So what we'd like to do is really study today the alternatives to these dominant narratives. We also see that beyond this second wave of titling and the commodification of natural resources, many social movements are presenting alternatives to the current developments, and they refuse the statu quo. They refuse the choice between either things not changing and poor communities being relegated to low incomes and to subsistence farming, in particular for the rural poor, or being co-opted into the capitalist system in which nature is nothing else than a commodity, and in which the distribution follows the rules of the market and goes to the highest bidder. And in many places, both in the north and in the south, there is a search for alternatives. The work that is done on common pool resources by Elinor Ostrom, the work that's done by Hanoch Dagan, for example, now with Sili Dagan in a joint paper on the liberal commons and how the legal framework could be organized to make commons more viable. These are the kind of alternatives we're looking for. And we hope that in the course of these 2 days, we will multiply discussions on a range of alternative solutions, a range of different models that can be more empowering, that can be more just, and that can show that there are alternatives to the dominant narratives again that are proposed. So with this, let me welcome you again to this symposium. Let me thank very warmly Raj for his superb work in organizing this, Alpen for his extremely effective management of all this process. Yes, the University of Louvain is co-organizing this, but really we did nothing more than ask Raj to do all the work and incentivize him to seek the funds under some joint program between UCL and the MIT. So as always happens in these partnerships, it's very imbalanced, and all the hard work has been done by them. Thank you again, Raj, for this.
Very generous, Olivier. Thank you very much. So we get started with the panel right away. We have four extraordinary thinkers with us today on the subject of global commodification of land, the multiple dimensions of which were discussed by Olivier. And we hope to have more in-depth discussion on different dimensions as well as the alternatives tomorrow. We are going to go down in terms of the list of speakers as they're listed on the program. So we'll start with Professor Philip McMichael, followed by Professor Saskia Sassen. Then we'll have Professor Ruth Hall, and then we'll conclude with Professor Duncan Kennedy. Each speaker will take about 20 minutes to outline their argument, and then we'll have roughly about 30 to 40 minutes for discussion and questions. So let me start by introducing Professor Philip McMichael. Philip is a professor and chair of development sociology at Cornell University. His research examines capitalist modernity through the lens of agrarian questions, food regimes, agrarian food sovereignty movements, and most recently, the implications for food systems of agrofuels and land grabbing. This work centers on the role of agri-food systems in the making of the modern world, including an examination of the politics of globalization via the restructuring of agri-food relations. These publications include Biofuels, Land and Agrarian Change, which was co-edited in 2011, and Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions. The book came out in 2013. So, Philip.
Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I'd like to thank Raj and Olivier for inviting me, and I'd like to thank Duncan and his minions for doing all the work behind the scenes. So I'm looking forward to this day and a half. Here we go. I'm going to talk about land grab governance and the crisis of market rule, and I have some slides, so let's get started. So I want to historicize the land grab, and very quickly I use a Brodelian framework arguing that there's long environmental time, long durée, and I use Jason Moore's world ecological regime here to capture that idea. The conjuncture, which is the recent neoliberal period in which the corporate food regime has been prominent in producing and intensifying a global agrarian crisis that resulted in the food crisis that Olivier mentioned. And then, of course, the event in the mid-2000s, the signal crisis of capitalism, if you like, but certainly of the food regime. These three social times, I'm arguing, led into the land grab of the last decade. I'm going to add a new social time, which is what I'll be talking about today, and that is that development, I think, is no longer about improving on the past, but managing the future. I'm framing this talk a little bit around the food regime, the corporate food regime, the cheap food regime, as Peter Ross had called it. Via Campesina said the massive movement of food around the world, that's food that was being dumped by the Europeans and the Americans, is forcing the increased movement of people off the land. I think now we're in a new phase, which I would call provisionally the land enclosure regime, and I would rephrase Via Campesina's little phrase, the massive movement of money around the world is forcing the increased movement of people. And I situate my paper around the power of the commodity form. So while displacement is the fundamental consequence of enclosure via the commodity form, I'm going to argue that the power to impose the commodity form has more far-reaching consequence in enclosing the future and, in fact, foreclosing future possibilities. And in this sense, the land grab and its governance is a power grab. In terms of the discourse of future management, I'm just arguing here that from, I guess, around the time of the Brundtland Commission in 1987, when it redefined development as sustainable development, we've seen attempts to sort of capture the crisis facing humanity. Scientific American said in 1989, self-conscious intelligent management of Earth is the great challenge facing humanity approaching the 21st century. And then, of course, the Earth Summit came along in 1992, and the concept of the global commons was articulated then. The idea was to protect waste sinks and biodiversity in particular from poverty, because it was argued that the poor were scrabbling away at the environment, knocking down forests, etc. And this was a big debate at the Earth Summit, and Indira Gandhi took a different position that, in fact, the destruction of the global environment was coming from the affluent global north. Nevertheless, the World Bank concluded that development was the way to go, and my simple point is that the concept of the global commons, protecting the global commons, necessarily privileged that direction against taking heed of preserving and protecting the local commons. So the crisis conjuncture in the mid-2000s came along, and there were three particular foci that emerged. Firstly, there was a new engagement with agriculture and global food security. Secondly, the financialization of agriculture now as an investment refuge. Financiers, investors were finding that manufacturing and service industries were not as profitable, and so agriculture, agro-food futures, land, etc. became the new investment refuge. And thirdly, the trope of managing Earth came around again in terms of land and green grabbing. So, no comment necessary there. So capitalism's ecological regime, which is Jason Moore's concept. And here I'm going to be really quick. The metabolic rift, whereby nutrient cycles were disrupted as agriculture became commercialized and farmers moved off the land, beginning with the enclosures in the 16th, 17th century. And agriculture became increasingly dependent on inputs, and nutrients were shifted to the cities, and the whole agricultural cycle has been part of humanity for so long before that was ruptured essentially, and so this is one example of what Jason Moore would refer to as the relative exhaustion of nature, the under-reproduction of nature because of the disruption of the nutrient cycle. And the argument was that such exhaustion in Moore's thesis is deferred by finding new commodity frontiers, the commodification of nature, colonialism, etc. And this was a crisis attenuation strategy for capital. The capital accumulation was sustained by finding new commodity frontiers. And so you get this dialectic of attenuation and generation of crisis in frontier cycles. In other words, as you commodify nature on the frontier, you begin to under-reproduce it, and so when it's worn out, you move on. So, of course, the big question is, are we approaching the absolute exhaustion of nature? And I think one of the good examples of this dialectic, the attenuation generation of exhaustion, of crisis, is the oil palm, for example, agrofuels, where forests are knocked down and a form of industrial agriculture replaces those forests as carbon sinks. And as we know, agrofuels are not going to solve the world's energy problem. Natural exhaustion began to be recognized either explicitly or implicitly. So in 2005, the Millennium Assessment, Ecosystem Assessment, claimed there was an irreversible loss of diversity of life on Earth. A couple of years later, the UNEP said that the planet's resources are in inexorable decline. And then in 2008, the International Assessment of Agricultural Science, Technology and Knowledge for Development claimed that agricultural expansion was the major driver of biodiversity loss on the planet, and that agriculture was indeed at a crossroads. And it's in this context that the concept of agroecology begins to take hold as an alternative path, a much more sustainable path than agroindustry. So now the question is, are we in a phase of exhaustion deferral, natural exhaustion deferral? The World Bank in 2008, in its World Development Report, refocused on agriculture in its development agenda. In the same year, the Food Crisis Summit was held because of the rising prices of food, and small farmers were now identified as the new object of development via private-public partnerships, investment in contract farming, and outgrower productivity. And I would argue here that this was an example, a very good example of recycling market solutions to problems that had already been created by markets. The shock doctrine was at work at this point. The Terra Preta Declaration came out parallel to the World Food Summit, and noted that the serious and urgent food and climate crises are being used by political and economic elites as opportunities to entrench corporate control of world agriculture and the ecological commons. And this declaration was actually written by myself and Shamali Guttel at that parallel conference. The crisis of market rule. The paper that I've written talks about the conjunction of these various crises. I think that it's financial, ecological, food, governmentality, and legitimacy, and the trade regime crisis I'll talk about in a little moment. And in the context of this conjunction of crises from about 2007 onwards, excuse me, we saw the land grab begin to take hold, as Olivier's pointed out, and land has become progressively redefined as a financial asset on the one hand, so investors are being encouraged to invest in land and are actually constructing investment houses around the investment in land offshore. Agro-security mercantilism is a provisional concept I use to capture the idea of states or sovereign wealth funds investing in land offshore. And we've seen that in particular from East Asian countries and from the Middle East, countries that see themselves as being compromised by food supplies and going around the trade regime, which is supposed to provide food through the marketplace, and this is what I was referring to about the crisis of the trade regime, that the WTO system, the Agreement on Agriculture, Liberalization of Trade, etc., was now being overridden by states that were actually taking matters into their own hand and investing offshore to produce food or agrofuels to bring back to their own country for consumers and for energy supplies. At the same time, we see the rise of different understandings of governance around the land grab. The World Bank's principles of responsible agricultural investment came out and was promptly countered by the Committee on World Food Security's tenure guidelines as an alternative, focusing on the kind of security of tenure that Olivier was alluding to without necessarily tightening land, and also looking particularly at issues of gender rights. And then, of course, there's the small RAI, the Small Responsible Agricultural Investment, which is a protocol that is currently wending its way through the Committee on World Food Security, and I'm involved with that whole process. It's a fascinating process. And I see these forms of governance, these protocols coming out as juxtaposing investor versus producer rights as a kind of a double movement. So Polanyi kind of rears his head here, I think, and I think that in many ways we're looking at the fictitious character of landscapes now with this kind of investment and the role of public authorities in enabling such market governance. We see forms of resistance to green grabbing, and if you look very closely, you can see some of the brands there from Amoco and British Petroleum. What do they call themselves? Beyond Petroleum or something now. But anyway, so these are the kinds of resistances that we see emerging around the world to this kind of green grabbing. The global power grab via commodification brings me back to my central theme, and the discourses, of course, are around feeding the world and saving the planet. Investors are capitalizing the future income streams via agricultural commercialization, and this is a key point here, and it refers to investment not only in land and in water access, but also in labour on the land, in genetic resources, and so forth. So capitalization here, drawing on the work of Bichler and Nitzan, I view as a precondition of power via the universalizing price architecture of the market, because once you subject resources to commodity relations, it's very difficult to turn them back, although that's what we're going to be working on in the future, right? And I'm arguing here that there's a process of enclosing the future in the name of shared humanity. In fact, the Secretary General of UNCED said, we're all in this together, shared humanity, and then Ian, Olivier referred to this a little bit. This kind of discourse is becoming very prominent, and it's always important to recognize that humanity is not exactly equal. And this little picture comes from Aki Hoogveldt's piece in Globalizations, I believe, from 2006. It's quite a pretty stunning differentiation of the world's population, in the sense that 50% are essentially excluded. The political ontology of this crisis, I think, is very important. The crisis attenuation that I referred to earlier has all the makings of compounding the crisis, subjecting lands, forests and waterways to financial calculus, regardless of the local meaning, territorial belonging, spirituality, the importance of the connection between humans and the land, the notion of agrarian citizenship that Hannah Whitman talks about, the notion of the natural contract, all in the name of shared humanity. And I argue in the paper that the global commons concept is a class act, not a classy act, but a class act. The idea of the virtual alienation of ecosystems to financiers, the naturalization of the market as a crisis manager, and as a technology of exclusion. I think that's a very important point to emphasize there. We tend not to put it like that, but I think it's a way of thinking about the way in which the market is in fact a vehicle of power in a very profound way. So moving now to investor rights, capital's crisis attenuation, of course, is simultaneously crisis generation for land users, for habitat and for eaters. Common property resources are redefined as financial resources, and we get this phenomenon where corn, soy and palm oil can double or triple as food, feed and fuel crops, which are responsible entirely now to financial rather than a social or ecological calculus. So the decision about what to grow or whatever has been grown, how to use it, is made in boardrooms as opposed to on the ground. And so you get this kind of fungible or flex crop ontology that is depicted, I think, quite nicely in this cartoon. We also see the rise of the bioeconomy that's transforming plants into industrial products, and so more and more, I mean, these water bottles are probably made from plant-based. And of course, that means that industrial processes are shifting towards using the land more and more to replicate industrial products, and of course, that puts more and more pressure on the land and on the people who the land uses. So, property formation. I just want to make a quick comment here that the fetishization of agriculture and nature, like this kind of fungibility, and as virtual commodities, represent exchange value par excellence being applied to the land. And when means of life are so fungible, life and livelihoods are essentially privatized. And the quick example I would use there is the neoliberal concept of food security, the right to purchase food as a property relation. Property formation, the fetishism of agriculture and nature as virtual commodities. Oh, here we go. So commodification, I see. How could I not see that? Tracy Osborne in JPS talks about the Lacandon maize farmers who suffered double enclosure through the price form, corn dumping from the United States, driving them out of business, and then having to resort to carbon forestry as an alternative income. And this I see as enclosure via market rule, first of all NAFTA, and then the clean development mechanism, which Larry Lohman retitles the cheap development mechanism. And of course the loss of food sovereignty as a consequence. Public authorities being reformulated. I think this case offers a lens on the shift in meaning of state-controlled territories from a spatial to a relational conception. Territorial governance by sovereign states, of course, still, but within the terms of these international regimes, whether carbon or food regimes. The reformulation of the property relation, landscape modification reformulates the meaning of property. from national territory to scarce global resource, centralizes proprietary control of landscapes and public authorities. Future claims, subjecting landscapes to value form, enables the reformulation of property as a future claim, refocuses public authority on global future planning, market rule exerting a proprietary ontological claim over available land, landed or virtual resources as such. Future claims, just finishing up here. Somehow this is stuck. There we go. So, contestation around land grab governance. The point I'm just making in this slide is that the Committee on World Food Security is a formal body with the food security mandate, but we're seeing these public-private partnerships initiated by the G8 and the G20 beginning to circumvent the UN system and undermine its role. So the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition is one very good example of this counter movement. This second to last slide here. Private investment in agricultural corridors for agro-industrial projects in Africa, requiring these cooperation framework agreements by states. I'm hitting the wrong button here. And of course, confidential relations are taking place between corporations and states, but no consultation with producer organizations and civil society organizations. Then we have the Value Chain Project, where AGRA, the Alliance for Green Revolution in Africa, talks about land values. Increasing in land holdings will be induced to adjust from self-reproduction to agro-input dependency. My point here is the enclosure of agriculture via these value relations is simply capitalizing the future as a power grab. And I reformulate the sustainable development concept of Brundtland to development that meets the needs of the present by compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs rather than without compromising. So, last slide. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Philip. We now move on to Professor Saskia Sassen, who is the then Professor of Sociology and a member of the Committee on Global Thought, Columbia University. Her fields of study encompass phenomena such as global governance, immigration, and changes within the liberal state resulting from current transnational conditions. Her recent books are Territory, Authority, Rights, From Medieval to Global Assemblages in 2008, and A Sociology of Globalization in 2007, A Cities in the World Economy in 2012, and Expulsions, When Complexity Produces Elementary Brutalities, is coming out in 2014. I'm already exhausted just reading it.
Me too, actually. Writing was hard work. Well, thank you, Philip, for an amazing presentation. You needed 2 hours, actually. You may not know that. So I want to do something slightly different. The pursuit of acquiring land is happening under many diverse format. So I look also at the grabbing of urban land. How do you grab urban land? By buying buildings. And I'm trying actually to look at both at the same time. And if we take this expanded version of land grabs as the X, the way I'm working it is by focusing on the non-X, as a way of sort of not directly, not just detailing the elements of land grabs. And there are three sort of theoretical tools, if you want, that I'm using. The first one is a question of territory, which I'm very interested in. We actually collectively, in diverse parts of the world, made territory. Territory is a very powerful condition with embedded logics of claim-making and embedded logics of power. So in our modern liberal state, etc., claim-making is the version of citizenship, etc., when, as an example, not to hit on any particular country, when China buys 2.8 million hectares of land in Zambia and another 2.5 in Congo to create a palm plantation. It actually, all kinds of things happen. And territory is downgraded to land. There is expulsion of floras, faunas, villages, rural manufacturing, districts, small farmers, etc., etc. But there is also the fact that what was a complex category that is collectively made and that has terrain as only one element is actually downgraded to land, earth that will deliver some goods. And in that sense, actually, that process in itself is a commodifying, I argue. You know, a reduction of something that otherwise contains multiple capabilities. And so when people, rural economies, small farmers are expelled, all kinds of genealogies of meaning are expelled as well. So they disappear, go to the urban shanties, and pretty soon we will forget that they once were farmers. There is an expelling of a lot of stuff, a lot of knowledges, and a lot of meanings. And so I'm trying to actually recover the simplifying, the flattening of what starts out as a very complex condition that is partly at least collectively made. Small rural farmers brought all kinds of meanings, created all kinds of knowledges around that, and that sort of suffers a process of erasure. The second conceptual tool is something that I call expulsions, which I'm not thinking of in terms of social exclusion. Right? This is something, social exclusion happens inside the system. This is something that means crossing a systemic edge. Now, I mean, one way of sort of framing it is to say that, you know, at some point, the language of more inequality, more poverty, more land grabs, more expulsions of people from whatever, homes, you know, in cities or land in the global south. At some point, that language is insufficient to capture the particularity of the processes involved. And so I'm using this language of expulsions, by which I mean something, a variety of processes that lead to a crossing of systemic edges, not to be confused with geographical borders. Systemic edges are in many different places, including downtown Manhattan, so to speak. And when one crosses that systemic edge, whether it is a process, a condition, a person, you know, a part of an economy, if you want, an economic space, there is a capacity that gets mobilized that renders it invisible. So let me illustrate with what is probably one of the clearer examples. When in January, in 2013, in January, the IMF and the European Central Bank declared Greece is back on track, the economy of Greece is back on track. There is 0. whatever growth. And Moody's upgraded Greek government debt. What they left out was the fact that the space for measuring excluded about 30% of the Greek formal workforce, of families, and even of space. Now, that is an example that you can apply also to other situations, not just to that Greek situation. In other words, this just as a way of illustrating how we measure what is going on. There is a whole debate, some of you may be familiar with it probably, about the shortcomings of GDP per capita growth as a way of measuring growth. So I'm just using that as an example. This is not the point in itself. And what happens when we look at some of these processes that are of concern to this meeting in terms of land grabs and some of the sort of implications of that? What all do we lose? What all disappears? What all becomes invisible? Back to the displaced small farmer. She leaves her plot of land. She leaves behind the meanings, those genealogies of meaning. She leaves behind the making of something, is in a shanty town, and pretty soon, the fact that she ever was a little farmer and she had actually knowledge about a whole variety of things involved in that farming, is total erasure. That for me is an expulsion. And I look at that, again, not just in terms of land grabs, I look at that in terms of our very advanced economies as well. The third element, the third non-X, is something that I'm beginning to think of as predatory formations. Not predatory elites, we have those too, but predatory formations, which are these assemblages of technical systems, electronic networks, very importantly, legal elements, types, types of laws, etc. And then, sure, elites, powerful owners of land and capital and such. But it is not just people. The implication is that even if we lined up all the big owners of capital and we shot them all, this is not very nice language, we would not have solved the problem. And the question of law that is, I think, at the center of this is extremely important because law is a narrative, it explains how things are. Secondly, it has a capacity to render visible and to render invisible. I'm particularly interested in those aspects of law. What all is left out? And hence, again, this notion of expulsions. Now, I wanted to show you a few slides, but my kinds of slides, all right? And I want to start with an urban setting. It's probably familiar to many of you. Just to destabilize a bit the discourse that is being built here around land grabs in the Global South, which actually you have developed a discourse that we who work in the Global North haven't quite developed like this. And we need, I want that to be mobile, to migrate also, and have the capacity to explain some of the things that are happening in the Global North. And Detroit might be an example, or whatever. But so one thing is, of course, and I mean, the larger story for which there is no time here has to do with the financializing of everything, right? Student loans, used car loans, etc. But also the use of financial instruments to expel people in vast numbers. So you may be familiar with these figures, those of you who live in the United States. You know, these are foreclosures. Foreclosure does not necessarily mean that you're out of the house, but this, according to our central bank called the Fed, 9.2 million have been thrown out of their house. Now, 9.2 million households can be up to 30 million people. I'm Dutch. My little country has 16 million people. This is a very short, brutal history. It is as if somebody said, all of you, this is back to the Netherlands, all of you on the territory of the Netherlands, out. That takes care of 16 million expulsions. And now, we do it again. We repeat the exercise. These are vast numbers, and they are invisible. These people, the spaces from which they have been expelled become invisible. Now, this is pure materiality. People, buildings, streets. What do we call these gardens? What do you call the hedge, the fence? What do you call it in English? You know, when you have a little garden, whatever. The lawn. Pure materiality. We have thousands of people in the United States living in the same kinds of tents that are used in the international refugee system. Very neat little blue tents. And they're invisible. So I am very interested in this question of how do we render visible, because materiality by itself is not enough. And in that sense, Raj, the reason I was very excited to come is more to learn than me to teach you something or to tell you something that you might learn from. Because I really think you have developed a whole discourse, especially through legal instruments, I guess, but also through the empirics, the experiences. Now, I want to just continue a bit more. These are the foreclosures in Europe. So I have the full list of all the 27. So the highest are happening in Hungary, Germany, Spain, United Kingdom. I wonder how many people have you heard that? And those people, again, once they're out, now the numbers are so much smaller then. And the lowest are Bulgaria, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, Denmark, those nice, good countries up there. What do we call them? You know, the nice... Anyhow. This is the power of finance. Finance develops an instrument that may have been declared illegal in the United States, but it travels. I have some graphs that I have made where I show the potential for this instrument. In other words, where are the 2 billion lower middle class households that could be subjected to this treatment? Now, again, we may want to come, but this is not the occasion really, to talk about what is this financial instrument that delinks profits for the high-level circuit, predatory formations, from the value of the material asset, the value of the market. All of that doesn't matter. The brilliance is to develop 14 steps that delink the value of that material asset and to create an asset-backed security that generates a lot of profits in the high finance circuit. Now, this is also happening with the question of land grants. There are these incredibly complex contractual arrangements, brilliant minds, to produce what? Elementary brutalities in the end. Now, I could go on and on about this. Now, I'm sure you all know this. This I have from this wonderful set, Land Matrix and Brush for Land, I think, Olivier. I know that these data have been discovered to have certain limitations, but what data does not. And so I just to give you, and Europe too. Now, the way these particular set of measures are, they only include 200 properties or plots of land that are bigger than 200 hectares. So it leaves out very tiny ones. That is why Europe shows so small, because I have gone digging into Europe. In Europe, there's quite a bit of land grabbing. So farmers, the younger generation of farmers in France, they can't get land because the corporates are buying it up. Now, they're not buying up, 2 million hectares, but they're buying up whatever. And in that context, then, I bring in this acquiring of urban land, which is really a big, I don't know if anybody saw the Financial Times story that came out. It's a huge footprint of foreign-owned land in the middle of London. And we have that in New York, we have that in about 20 cities. Now, another implication here, and this just, illustrates some of the points that Philip made. Most of it is for biofuels. Now, what happens when you do biofuels? You can use pesticides and fertilizers, poison the land. And so now we have areas in Argentina and Brazil, where I grew up in Argentina, where you always had poverty, but you never had hunger. Now we have hunger, because the workers are no longer growing what they can also eat. They're growing something that they cannot eat. Plus, as we know, there is a lot of data, you probably know much more about this than I do, the shadow effect of a palm plantation. So even the little farmers who live around, they lose their land is dead. I have in my new book a chapter that I call Dead Land, Dead Water. This notion that we are expelling bits of life from the biosphere herself. Now, there are a lot of growth curves. This is displaced people. I think that is also part of it. Now, this is due to war, due to all kinds of things. This is a very particular measure. It just measures some of the displaced. But when you look at this issue, again, the lens of expulsions, the loss of this notion of territory, that is what I'm after. And then, of course, you have this kind of growth, corporate profits after tax. I'm going to end now. And there, there's a little crisis that lasted about half an hour. It lasted more like a year and a half. And then, then it went higher than ever. I have in my new book a whole series of curves that show, and somebody mentioned it, Michael, I think you did again. Philip, I'm sick for you. Philip. That crisis, when we talk about financial crisis, that was like a dip. They had to change some of the machinery, and poof, there they went again. The crisis lies elsewhere, but it is not a financial crisis. It is a crisis of a different sort. Now, I just want to, again, leave you with this image. Very briefly, I return to these sort of 3 non-X: territory expulsions and predatory formation, to sort of make an argument that this is a period when what had become complex, stabilized meanings, the state, the middle class, the national economy, whatever, a whole bunch of them, are profoundly unstable. We tend to still use a lot of the same vocabulary, But are we really grabbing, or are we just grabbing bits and pieces of it? And so for me, sort of one image that I have, when I use some of these terms, including land grabs, by the way, any term that has the capacity to explain and to evoke a world, you know, in one word, one for me, just tactical question that I cannot let go of when I'm doing my research is, what don't I see when I say land grabs? And so one of the things that I was trying to do here is the non-X, right? There's a world of complexities that is also part, if you want, of this landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saskia. Thank you, Saskia. Our next speaker is Professor Ruth Hall, who is an associate professor at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and holds a DPhil in politics and an MPhil in development studies from the University of Oxford. She has published 3 books on aspects of land and agrarian reform in South Africa, including Another Countryside, Policy Options for Land and Agrarian Reform in South Africa in 2009. Her current work focuses on the Southern Africa region and beyond and deals with land rights, agricultural commercialization and land grabbing, the impacts of these processes on rural communities, smallholder production, food security and rural politics, and policy options to defend land rights and to build pro-poor pathways of agrarian change.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you both and to your wonderful teams for inviting me here, and to Alphen for wonderful arrangements. It's a real privilege to be here and be part of this. I have not got a paper that is being circulated yet, nor do I have a PowerPoint, but I have notes towards a paper which I hope to share with you all quite soon. And the title of the paper is Commodification of the African Commons, Discursive Competition over the Land Grab and over Defining Alternatives. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about what I see as 4 responses to the global land grab. But firstly, I wanted to comment on something that really stood out for me in the description of this project. I was both inspired but also somewhat puzzled by a portion of that description which read that commodification of natural resources is also a channel through which the North can have access to the resources of the South. And this made me pause for thought. I come from a country in which nearly 90% of the land is privately titled. And I also come from a continent in which under 10% of the land is privately titled. So I'm very aware of these different historical processes through which these patterns of commodification have come about and the social relations that they've produced. My thinking is really that the North-South frame doesn't adequately capture the patterns of resource capture that are underway. Indeed, my own country, if that is a useful unit of analysis, I'm also starting to doubt if that is, represents in many respects both North and South, both developed and developing, both grabber and grabbee. So I feel that really what our attention needs to focus on is the direction of these flows of capital accumulation, whether these are proximate or not. So my interest is really to look at this question in a historical manner, and what our work and work with our research networks across many African countries is showing is that there are recurring moments of commodification and the creation of large-scale commercial agriculture in Africa. And we see in the colonial period the creation of large estates and enclaves, the disappearance, the wiping of those off the map at the moment of independence, but often the recreation of these large-scale commodified forms in the form of state farms. And after, in many senses, a hiatus, and through the moment of neoliberalism, the privatization of these state farms and their re-emergence through multinational capital. And in many ways, the memories of these past histories of commodification live on, even in national cadastres. So in some of the cases that we've been looking at, these are the same estates that are being revived at these various historical moments. In Mozambique, for instance, we've been looking at the South African sugar company Louvain, which has established its operations in Maputo province in southern Mozambique. Objections from local people who were displaced by this investment carry no legal weight, as the Kadaster still reflects this as surveyed state property, harking back to the former state farms, and in turn, even prior to independence, to a Portuguese colonial estate. The same is true of the South African investment, the land deal in the Congo, on land where the refugees from Cabinda, from the Angolan War, as well as autochthones, all of whom have lived there for several decades. But this too is defined in the national legal codes as state land, and also a former French colonial estate. So it seems to me that they're both property regimes and colonial property codes that neglect customary land tenure, and the production regimes of capital-intensive agriculture have been revived and also expanded in this neoliberal moment. And so I think that really in the African context, the critical issue is the continuity of colonial legal codes and the perpetuation in particular of the inferior treatment of customary land rights, which is the basis for almost all Africans to have property. So that it's the non-recognition of these customary rights as being real property rights that is the basis for the land grab. And in the paper by Liz Alden Wiley, which I think is the best titled academic paper I've come across, "Whose Land Are You Giving Away, Mr. President?" There's a particularly wonderful quote that I'd like to share. She says that in response to the land grab, remedy lies in legal acknowledgement that customary and other long-standing unregistered land tenancy amounts to a real property interest, registered or not. Without this change, she says, the majority of rural landholders remain little better than squatters on their own land, a condition already wrongfully endured for a century or more. While hardly new, the current wave of state-backed leasing hardens an already dangerous dichotomy between the interests of governments and their people. And I think that she really captures an important point there. What we are seeing is that Africa's land is being privatized in what appears to be a rapid and possibly irreversible process of commodification. And I think now what we're seeing is the contestations over this and over what is to be done really fracturing. So I think we're at a critical moment. The way I'd see it is that the land grab literature has gone through 3 phases. The first phase featured something of a quantitative obsession. It was all about numbers, cases, in order to prove the scale and the nature of the land grab. I think that this gave way very quickly to a very interesting second phase based on empirical and field-based studies, producing finely grained understandings of processes and also impacts. But these are difficult to aggregate, and I think that they've thrown up important conceptual and also definitional questions regarding the land grab. For instance, grab versus concentration of land. And I think in the third phase, it's about alternatives and contestations over defining the terrain for discussing alternatives. And I feel we are in phase 3. And in this phase, I think that there are these 4 broad responses that I would like to draw attention to. The one is what I call cascading land grabs. And this refers to really this more horizontal and local dimension of land grabbing rather than the much more widely recognized international large-scale top-down land grab. So I'm thinking of countries like Zambia, Kenya, Malawi, also Ethiopia, where in the context of expectations and perceptions of scarcity, of rising value, rural as well as urban elites have been acquiring land at a rapid rate, looking to capitalize on ground rents in a future of heightened land scarcity, and in the process accentuating processes of social differentiation that are already underway. So like foreign investors, domestic and localized land grabbers or buyers, because there's a gray area here, want not those vast unutilized tracts of land that the bank finds in its satellite imagery, but precisely the same land that is most prized by local people, including family farmers. It's the land that has fertile soil, that has good access to water, that's close to urban centers or at least to transport networks. So the land grab appears then not so much a 2-dimensional, one-way, top-down process, but rather I see it as a multifaceted, dynamic, and 3D kind of process, where the commodification of property relations that is being brought about through large-scale land grabs is precipitating a whole wave of local and intra-community land grabs. And it's really the interaction between the two that I think it needs to be understood. So I've got some examples from Kilombero in Tanzania, where the South African sugar company Ilovo has taken over what was also a former colonial estate and state farm, but is expanding its footprint in the region through massive outgrow schemes. And as farmers switch from food to sugar crops, they're being forced to split their production because of the pressure on land. They need to acquire land for food production elsewhere and are now splitting their livelihoods between multiple places. As one man in Msolwa and Jamaa village said, at the beginning this village had big land and each family was able to be given 2 hectares, and if you wanted more land you could easily lease it. But now there have been incomers and land has become scarce. Some people are able to get extra land for cultivating crops, but they have to travel 2 hours by piki-piki, by motorbike, to reach it. Sometimes they have to sleep there. So people are socially affected as they have to build and live in 2 homes, one during the rice season and one during the sugar season. So I think that what we're seeing here is the emergence of dual and spatially distinct tenure and production systems, where the customary ownership of sugar is where the state is now intervening to prioritize titling as a basis for people to acquire credit, alongside informal rental markets of customary land rights for food crop production. One of the only ways to get access to finance if you're not a big farmer in this context is to enter into block farming supported by large milling companies, and to cede one's land to a block farm in return for access to bank finance and membership of an association, of a sugar association. And so this is how tenure is affected by commercialization. I find it incredibly ironic that it is the market economy in the context of customary land rights that is actually driving collectivization. What we're seeing actually is recollectivization of the poor under neoliberalism. So this is what's happening in Kilombero. This is in the context where transacting land is well underway, and there are thriving sale and rental markets in customary land rights. But actually selling land, finally, is deeply unacceptable. As one woman said, once you sell your land, where will you eat? Everyone who was growing sugar said sugar was for paying school fees and paying for general household expenses. Food was something you need to produce yourself. The second broad area of response to the land grabs I want to discuss has to do with resistance and responses at local level. One example of these discourses that we witnessed last year was at the Pan-African land hearings, an interesting piece of sort of political theatre put together by researchers and activists, where community leaders from across several countries came to present testimony to a tribunal of eminent people, including parliamentarians from several countries. And here we had a powerful narrative of loss, of struggle, often stories of vulnerability as well as strength. One speaker, Rebecca Onyango from Siaya, Yala Swamp in Kenya, was a widow who'd lost her land to the US evangelical company Dominion Farms. And she said, if you are a lioness and you were rained on, let nobody think you are a cat. You are still a lioness. So I think that there are these emerging stories, and what struck me at this event were the powerful voices, particularly by women farmers, who were insisting that they do want investment, and that they want investment, and they want investment from private sources, but they also want their states to come back and deal with them directly. But not the kind of investment that they've seen up to now, and I think that this is a critical area for alternatives to be crafted. One of the demands is to return and to reoccupy land that has been acquired. One example was at Kilwa in southern Tanzania, where the American company BioShape acquired a lease for 80 years, started production of a trial jatropha plantation, but then withdrew after 1 year. But the land is permanently alienated. Under the Tanzanian legal system, the conversion of village land to general land, i.e. state land, endures even after the end of this investment. So it never returns to the villagers. The demand of the villagers is the right to reoccupy the land. But it's striking for me that even though the investor has been gone for now 6 years, people have not reoccupied and are waiting for permission to do so. It's an incredible example of the power of this property regime, that a lease that has been cancelled, the conversion of village land to state land, endures even in the absence of any investment. There have been positive responses as well. There are the observatories, the land rights observatories established in several countries, often in partnership with civil society organizations. In Tanzania, the NGO Haki has set up systems of grassroots organizers and activists who are land rights monitors, who institutionalize a system of bottom-up whistleblowing on transgressions by both state officials and investors. There are the examples of community titling that have been advanced in many African countries. The idea that rather than private formalization of title, it's titling of entire community land that presents the best option for defending the customary land rights of most people. But I think this is problematic, and I think that we need to think really hard about these kinds of alternatives. One reason why I think it's problematic is that formalization in the form of titling, even of community titling, is a mechanism of commodifying common property resources, and it undermines a property regime that is complex, and which my colleague Ben Cousins at CLAS calls a nested system of property rights that differentiates between multiple land users and uses, so at different levels, individual, family, kinship, village, clan, etc., multiple rights and entitlements to different resources at different scales. This is a system of property that is socially embedded and is not reducible to individual property rights, but at the same time, the titling of entire community land forms a basis for the transaction and permanent alienation of that land. The third, and I think a crucial response that we need to understand, is the way in which both at African regional level and globally, new governance discourses have emerged to claim the center ground around alternatives. What I see is the urgency expressed by the G8 countries and also lots of development agencies about getting private investment into African agriculture. And this is a position that's established as an a priori necessity. This has prompted a huge research and consulting industry about ways to avert land grabs in two ways. One is ensuring procedurally transparent land-based investments, and also substantively enabling inclusive business models, even while privatizing land and other natural resources. So I think there are real questions to be asked about whether these are alternatives to land grabs or more of the same in more sanitized form. I've been involved with organizing a major conference together with the FAO and the African Union, African Development Bank and UNECA. And the interesting issue that we faced in organizing this is that we weren't agreed on the terminology. The idea was to present research about alternatives to land grabs, alternatives that involve land-based transactions, and alternatives that avoid land-based transactions, as Jun would put it. But FAO cannot talk about land grabs. They agree that what is happening is something like that, but we can only talk about inclusive business models for large-scale land-based investment. So around Africa, there's the proliferation of this industry on IBM for LSLBI. IBM for LSLBI that's the center ground in which both state institutions, donor agencies, and the private sector are working. I used to think that IBM had something to do with computers, but now I understand that there's a new world of IBM for LSLBI. So I think that the challenge here is, unless there are substantive alternatives to the land grab, then the center ground in this governance discourse remains focused on this question: what will be the terms on which rural people will be separated from their land and their property rights converted into commodified form? Property in return for what? Will it be for wage labor, for rental income, land for equity models, and so on? So the presumption in all of these areas of work is that existing forms of non-privatized property rights and family-based production systems, particularly in Africa, impose an unfair burden on the global market. This is just the point that Olivier made earlier. I see this most vividly depicted in the World Bank's report from 2009 called Awakening Africa's Sleeping Giant. It was authored by agricultural economist Hans Binswanger, who argues that essentially the Guinea Savannah zone of Africa, stretching from the Western Bulge through the southern Sahel to the Horn and all the way down to Mozambique, that this agroecological region represents the last vast land reserve in the world and is the key to meeting the growing world demand for food. Again, the selfish poor must release it for the common good. And in all of this, what I see is that the G8 countries have set up two initiatives that I think set up a dangerous dualism, and I think that this is something that we should discuss in the coming day and a bit. The one is the procedural questions around governance and land rights, the Land Transparency Initiative. And the other is the new alliance on food security and nutrition, which is the mechanism through which countries make concessions on regulation of markets in return for new flows of private investment. And I wonder whether or not the separation of the land rights and the production system is actually key to the problem. I think that perhaps the emerging land sovereignty, food sovereignty discourse is about trying to reconnect the land with the production system. Examples of the policy and governance responses in Africa. The African Union's Land Policy Initiative launched its Nairobi Action Plan on LSLBI, which did two things. One is acknowledge that land grabbing was underway, while simultaneously confirming that land-based investment is the model for African development, emphasizing the need to minimize the negative impacts of large-scale land acquisitions rather than questioning the direction of change. Similarly, UNCTAD says it wants greater transparency in land transactions and developing good land governance systems. But these commitments come across as merely glib in view of the actual systems devoted to realizing them. In Africa, the AU's LPI, the Land Policy Initiative, mandated to implement the African Union's framework and governance guidelines, as well as the FAO voluntary guidelines, consisted of 2 people between 2009 to 2014, only this year, joined by other colleagues. Their task was to operationalize these systems in regional institutions and even down to member state level. So these are the governance responses to manage and channel and address the governance concerns of the land grab rather than to substantively look at alternative directions of change. At the same time, and this is my 4th theme, the private sector is also re-strategizing. I was struck recently that the South African sugar company, Ilovo, features on its website that it is aware of the global land grab and is only targeting brownfields sites, in other words, these former state farms or other established areas, rather than the green fields. So clearly, there's some sensitivity to being accused of land grabbing, and there is reputational and political risk involved. But by and large, what I see as being the center ground is the definition of inclusive business models, and agribusinesses selling the idea that contract farming is the win-win solution to avoid land acquisition, except for minimal nucleus estates or mills. So I think that the land grab itself really reflects the triumph of the scarcity narrative that in quite Malthusian ways has come back to dominate our global discourses, which identifies aggregate food supply at global level as the central justification for private investment in African land and agriculture. And I see agribusinesses and other investors actually aggressively promoting this discourse. It's key to their business model. All the land investment funds now feature the predictable factoids in their marketing materials. 9 billion people by 2015, the meatification of diets in Asia, the need to double food production, Africa being the last frontier. They emphasize, following Mike Davis's excellent work, The Planet of Slums, that Africa has a rapidly growing urban population, and they relish the market opportunity of growing consumer demand that this represents. But I think what this narrative omits is that in spite of urbanization, in absolute terms, rural African populations are growing, and that those who are urbanizing are doing so largely to eke out very marginal livelihoods on the periphery of the cities, rather than to buy McDonald's meals. And I think that in this agrarian transition of a sort that is underway, based on dispossession, the critical difference between this and the enclosures of the past in Europe is that in this context there is no industrial revolution accompanying this new enclosure wave. This is about expulsion of surplus livelihoods and surplus people. So in conclusion, My general observation is that the peasant movements, Via Campesina and others, have won the argument that the commercialization underway is a land grab. The land grab critique is a real victory. It's actually become mainstream. So right from the margins through the work of Via Campesina, its allies, Grain and others, this critique has been accepted across the board. But my worry and the issue that I think we need to look to is whether this victory may yet be hollowed out as the attention turns to the substantive question of what kind of land use and the forms and sources of investment to enable increased productivity and commercialization, which are so often held up as self-evident objectives on which we should all agree. In view of this, I think, in response to one of the questions posed in this project, is a human rights framework adequate? And my sense then is the answer must be no. Extending the right to tenure, to the right to food, to the right to a livelihood is a complex thing. We can't separate the rights to property from the economic environment that shapes the rights holders' use and benefit from property. Similarly, the struggles over property rights and the struggles over property use are integrally linked. This suggests that the human rights framing has to engage with political economy. So finally, I think that while there are these struggles playing out on the ground, what I want to point to is the discursive fight over framing this process of commercialization and alternatives to it. And I think that poses particular challenges to those who want to seek ways not merely to smooth the path of privatization and commodification, but to halt and to reverse it. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hall. Our final speaker is Professor Duncan Kennedy, who leads our introduction in Cambridge. Duncan is the Carter Professor of General Jurisprudence at Harvard Law School, and he's been a full professor at Harvard Law School since 1976. In March of 2010, he received an honoris causa PhD title from the University of Los Angeles. His research interests are very vast. They include, among other things, law and third world economic development, left-wing law and economics, and legal history. He's a founding member of the critical legal studies movement, and he has taught law and development, globalization of law and legal thought, and private law theory, among other courses. And I think at one point you taught a course on housing as well, in the 90s, right? He's the author. I might have comments, you know, I did, that's right. He's an author of some of the most amazing and most penetrating works in legal thought. Among them, a critique of adjudication in 1997, which is widely influential in the legal field. And 3 globalizations of law and legal thought, which I know Alice Amsden and myself have used several times, and we inflicted that piece on all the students here at planning. But on the evictions issue, he has recently written on anti-eviction and development of the global south. So, Duncan.
I don't have slides either. I must say that listening to these 3 presentations I found it riveting, and I really, really learned a lot from them in a very complicated way, because in the X, not X imagery, I experienced myself as not X in relationship to all 3 of the presentations. So this is really, what I'm going to present is in many ways a kind of inversion of perspective. It comes actually keyed into Ruth's final remarks about the human rights perspective. The piece that I wrote came from collaboration with Lucy White and Jeremy Perelman, 2 human rights lawyers who work in Africa and do other kinds of clinical human rights work, who organized a project about the question of resistance and the question of alternatives. But not resistance and alternatives at the level, the very, very impressive, complex, and challenging level that was presented by all 3 of you, where the problem is to think outside the box of a global governance system. Not that at all. They were about, and my participation was about, actual movements on the ground of land occupants, possessors, who were threatened with displacement or eviction, who organized against it. And the question was, how could human rights-based advocacy support, in an effective way, moments of popular mobilization at the slum level in most cases, though some of their cases are agricultural. It's overwhelmingly a project about urban resistance to something that is never called, in the context, is not likely to be called land grab, that being so deeply connected to the agricultural context. So I'm going to briefly describe, very briefly describe the instance of resistance that my paper attempted to collaborate in. So that's the idea. The idea was the paper was supposed to collaborate, be an act of collaboration with an actual popular movement, very localized moment of resistance to displacement or eviction. And then the way in which the sort of lawyerly thinking about it led me and the other participants to try to think through alternatives. So it's first about resistance, and then it's about alternatives. But neither the global governance frame you'll see is relevant, but the category commodification or commercialization just doesn't, cut much ice in the context of these urban slum territories, where it's obvious to everyone land and housing is commodified. It's not about title. Sometimes there's title, sometimes there isn't. So here's the starting example, is the Nigerian federal government rivaling with one of the state governments of Nigeria, have decided that there is this very significant tract of land which will be appropriate for high level residential and commercial development. It's a slum, a large slum. And they get the World Bank to agree to guarantee a loan, and then there are going to be giant private contracts to do all the stuff. And all these players are crucial. So it's not agribusiness, that's not the image. It's the federal government, the state government, the contractors who will do the development for millions and millions of dollars, and the World Bank. So what happens is simply resistance. The people who live in the neighborhood, for various complicated reasons, although they're ethnically diverse, they're not socially homogeneous at the beginning. A very, very brilliant organizer, Felix Morka, fantastically rhetorically and organizationally skilled guy, with a lot of collaborators, produce a anti-eviction movement, and they actually do a bunch of things. They have rallies, they march, they engage human rights lawyers, lots of different human rights lawyers from different places. They are unbelievably badly beaten up in one of their demonstrations. They resist violently, and that's an incredibly important part of the story. The capacity for violence. Now, I'm not saying this in a condemnatory way, but in a praising way. One of the things that's the basis of property from below is the willingness to be violent, to reject the ethical, moral legitimacy of the legal order when the legal order favors the eviction. But in this case, actually, the background is they don't go to court because they know they'll lose. They won't lose because of a particular legal technicality, but because in this context, the court system is simply the idea that the law, again, Ruth and I really are not on the same page here. I don't think law has very much to do with this kind of thing, except in a place like South Africa where there's still a vibrant idea of the judiciary as a major intervener in the political and social context. I don't think there's any other country in Africa where that's true. I may be wrong. Where law has the significance, the judges will tell them to stop, or enjoin the government that it can't evict you until it's arranged alternative housing. I don't think there's anywhere else. And it's certainly not true in the United States. So we have to be clear about that. So law, understood as somehow the state is controlled by the judiciary, is not a factor in the story. So here's what happens. The element of violence, but also mass mobilization, they get more and more local residents involved, and the local residents get more and more intense. various politicians in the area begin to see them as a possible source of some kind of political problem. The human rights lawyers think about various things they might do. And the most brilliant thing, they come up with an idea, which is a brilliant idea. They go to the internal dispute mechanism of the World Bank. So they actually, the World Bank has a whole elaborate process. It claims to be totally eco-friendly. It claims to be totally oriented to local impacts. And they actually go, and they really just, pardon my French, they bust the balls of the World Bank internally. They repeatedly petition. They do whole rounds of demands that the World Bank respond. And inside the World Bank, they become embarrassed. So the World Bank begins to put pressure on the Nigerian, two different levels of the Nigerian government. And that's really the single most effective thing they do. Although the World Bank is not legally bound by anybody to anything, there's no court that conceivably enforce anything that happens. But now this is about governance, but it's not the angle of governance that you guys have. It's not actually the evolution of new schemes of governance against existing malign schemes of governance. This is worming, this is from the bottom up. You're just a lawyer, the World Bank has the procedure, you invoke the procedure because you can manipulate it to embarrass the bank, which will then put pressure because it's going to guarantee the loans for the development. End of the first part of the story. It's very effective. Now the next question is, what do you do when the government has agreed to negotiate? And here I'd like to make a distinction between two orientations to the question. And the way it was posed again by Raj is not quite the way I proposed it. Too much emphasis on eviction, or the near Saskia's expulsion. There's another question. If you can resist using violence and manipulation of the governance regime, what's at stake is a surplus. So here now I want to contextualize this kind of struggle and claim a general point. All over the global south, situations like this could be the poor on the periphery, but it's not like that here or in the typical case. The poor all over the global south have been historically in the center. So the port city, the colonial port city, is a small city. There are lots of poor people in the small city. They're marginal, they're living on bad land, which can't be developed, but it could be next to the airport. It's very often next to the port. It's terrible. The rich people live on the hill, they live in a gully, or they live in a swamp. The housing is absolutely terrible, it's worth nothing. But normal commercial industrial development of these sites surround the neighborhood with higher levels. Now this is not always the case, but it's always happening. In other words, it's not uniform, but it's continuously generated by the inner economic territorial dynamics. It's a territorial dynamic. So in the periphery, when the periphery gets far enough out, it's economic to create a new center because it's now so far from the center. And the new center will produce a value discontinuity between the old poor settlements that surround the new center. So transferring land from poor use by poor people, crappy land, but now technology is advanced, you can fill the swamp, you can drain the swamp and fill it, you can build technically where it would have been incredibly expensive in the colonial period, now it's cheap. So the basic thing at stake is who's going to get the benefit of the difference in value. So it's a surplus, arbitraging the land from one use to another. So that's a separate question from expulsion. Who's going to get it? And now this is, again, a worm's eye view. You don't go to the court. It's not about that. It's not about the law of takings. It's not going to be enforced. The army does the expulsion. So here's some people who are going to get it. It's up for grabs. Let's say that if you develop it as high-cost residential housing, you'll be able to sell the housing for twice the cost of production because of the locational virtues. It's locationally fantastic. So there's an enormous surplus between the price at which it will be sold to consumers in the global economic system of expansion, and what it will cost to produce that apartment building. All that is the surplus. Well, if the developer, the state, or whoever, had to pay the market value in the new use, there would be no profit except normal entrepreneurial profit. All you get out of that, if you had to pay every bit of that surplus to the owner, there's no profit. The profit comes from getting the land for less than that. Well, if you don't have to pay anything, if the developer paid nothing, the developer gets it all. Option one. The army, in this case, it's the Nigerian army and police. You're not going to get those people out of there without paying them something. It would just be foolish to imagine. They're going to get a cut of that surplus for doing the dirty work of expulsion. Now, in the government, the people who do in the government who arrange the World Bank loan almost certainly will have a finger in that pie too. But also the government may tax it completely legitimately. They can tax it away, as we've learned from Henry George long, long, long ago. There's a potential government acquisition of the surplus. So, and then the developer. But then what about the residents? In this case, they have, using a series of techniques, blocked it. It doesn't matter what their formal property rights are at all. So the law is irrelevant. It's simply irrelevant. What counts is if you can block the development, you can get a piece of the surplus. This is lawyers speaking, as opposed to social scientists speaking. The way we think about it, the law is very often simply irrelevant to who gets the stuff. So now we're going to imagine that they're organized and they deal. They might deal in many ways. They might sell to the developer collectively a quarter of the site for a big sum of money and distribute the rest themselves. They're going to have to bargain, and the bargain will be determined by some legal background ideas, but also about the attitude of the bank to the internal complaint, the possibility of violence, who's armed, how scary the army is, whether the police is also relevant. All of these factors are going to strongly influence who gets how much of the surplus. But now, so that was the end of the first part. So the second part is, that's the resistance part. So then the alternatives part is this. It's a really complicated question. Almost certainly resistance is based on rights rhetoric. It almost always seems to be the case that rights are just big, partly because the people are totally divided. If you had a more culturally specific rhetoric, something more indigenous, something more historically pre-colonially African, forget it. It's like in an American urban slum, where there's different races and different ethnic groups, you can't have an Italian basis for resistance to gentrification of the North End if only a quarter of the population of the North End is Italian. So rights rhetoric is incredibly important as unifying, transcending the deep divisions, and it legitimates the leadership because they are the operators of rights rhetoric. And I'm totally in favor of that. Whatever floats the boat, I'm in favor of. Although I myself am a socialist, and I don't resonate deeply in my heart to that rhetoric. I really don't resonate to it at all. I resonate to the rhetoric of community, solidarity, collective planning, figuring it out, and like that, but hey, it's great. There's now a problem though, which is what meaning does it have? So we mobilize around rights, and then here are some alternative meanings. One alternative meaning would be, we are defending our right to housing, we demand compensation for the loss of the value of our housing. Or we demand compensation for the loss of the value of our housing and a share of the benefits of development. Or we demand not compensation individually for the value of our housing. We demand that our new organization use the money to construct social housing so the people who can make either customary or title claims, doesn't matter, that's just irrelevant. The point is we disregard the existing ownership structure, and social housing is redistributed within the community. Again, it's not about choice between customary and formal title. It's about class redistribution within the community. Or we could say, so that's the social housing option, social housing is not full absolute property rights because it will be limited equity. The people who occupy the social housing will get property rights, they'll be highly formal, they're completely commodified property rights, but they do not include free alienability without some kind of responsibility to give back to the community for the social housing project. So again, the legal category is not relevant. What's relevant is the deal. It won't be a property deal. It'll be commodified, but the interest will be less than feasible. Or, next stage, you can imagine that instead of limiting that organization as a community land trust or a community development corporation, it's a very familiar legal form. The next option would be, this would be the Alice Amsden option. And I like to mention Alice because here we are in the building where her memorial service was held, and this part of my stuff is totally enslaved to Alice. I mean, she was just brilliant on this kind of stuff. So this would be the mini developmental state inside the state. You negotiate using whatever capacities politically you've developed with the money. You've bought officials, you've organized election factions, and you have a policy of using the money not just for social housing. So you organize a latrine building program in which you use the money to create a little latrine corporate enterprise on the model of the East Asian tiger, in which you incentivize the latrine operation. They'll get a giant subsidy from you if they use local labor, train it, and develop so that you'll be able to build latrines elsewhere. You're going to be subsidized to build latrines. And you get the subsidy only if you successfully build latrines, not only domestically at a subsidized rate, but elsewhere. Now you're a mini developmental state. This is totally pie in the sky. I mean, so far it's never happened anywhere. The question is, what does it mean to talk about alternatives once resistance has occurred? So I think this, not the discourse of commodification, is the relevant discourse. Because all of these things are designed inside the property division. This corporation, this mini developmental state, owns property, it leases property, it has alienable property, The problem is design. And so Olivier's mention of Ostrom, for example, is a crucial thing. There is Hanak aussi. There's a whole literature, Hanak Dran, and also people like Ostrom have worked on that stuff. So the problem is now what's the real, for me, the ultimate issue is right at the beginning. How can one find what to do with, collaborate with the moment when the energy of negation, of violence, of willingness to sacrifice, of confrontation against eviction, that's the question. How can one collaborate in it when a little sign of it occurs and help it get to be strong enough to create property from below? Thanks.
Thank you, Duncan. We have about 20-25 minutes for comments and questions. All the speakers had very rich presentations, every one of which can be discussed individually for 25 minutes. But obviously, we're going to have to try to identify some common themes and some mentions that run through many of the presentations. What I would welcome you to do is to come to the mics. There are two mics, one on this side, other on that side. Please come and ask your questions or make your comments, but make them brief. And please introduce yourself when you do, because the thing is being recorded. So please use the the mic over there.
My name is Rajesh Pradhan. I'm a writer. Something that one professor from this Rust once wrote, I'm talking about Judith Kendler, it was something she found in one of her interviews, in one of her studies, that there is a pact. That pact is like a quid pro quo. And I also found that in several of my studies, signed between or understood between slum dwellers and city governments, that you vote for us, and we won't throw you out. But don't ask for any service from us. So I don't know, it's an empirical thing, but I wonder if you've encountered this.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have a question?
Do you want to answer, or perhaps take, or if you want to respond very quickly, that's okay. Otherwise, you want to take one or two more and then get them together? Because there might be connection between some questions. Yeah? Yeah.
My name is Smita Narula, and I want to thank all the panelists for such a thoughtful set of presentations. I had two comments. One is some of what I've been thinking about around these issues myself, and I was inspired by these conversations, is whether we are fencing ourselves in by the terminology that we're choosing to employ. Raj, you opened the conversation by saying that this network and this conference is focused specifically more on forced evictions as a result of development-induced displacement. And I've been thinking the terminology of development-induced displacement by itself brings some sense of greater common good, or that there is a balancing act in place. What if we were to change the terminology to talk about, at least in some of these instances, consumption-induced displacement? Wouldn't that then shift the focus on and allow for the analysis to be richer, because we would include ourselves as consumers in the conversation and actually put ourselves and our own patterns and behaviors as part of the aspects that we need to think about and need to create alternatives around, and put ourselves in more, I think, more of an active position, not just as analysts of captains of industry and what's happening to poor farmers, but what are we doing as consumers, and what is the kind of patterns that we're engaging in that's inducing this displacement. My second comment goes to Saskia's presentation, and I really appreciated your capturing of this idea of what else works, the expulsion of knowledge, and when you spoke about the small farmers, and you spoke about the female farmer, and what else is being lost. And it made me think of things in a more temporal way, sort of going further back. And I thought about us all being sort of the result of generations of that kind of expulsion, whether it was by choice or whether it was by the force of industrialization. Maybe I think of this because my grandparents were farmers, and I personally feel so detached and removed from the land. And everything that we've been taught growing up has nothing to do with nature and our love for it, but how to consume and industrialize and move forward in a particular way. And I raise that because, as someone who's spent a lot of pages actually talking about and thinking about why the World Bank and others are doing what they're doing, one part of the answer, I think, comes from the fact that we ourselves are so detached that we, and to quote Wendell Berry on this, that we cannot protect that for which we do not have affection. And we no longer have affection for it because we've been so removed from the land ourselves. And by we, I mean those who are in positions of power and policymakers, and who are setting the terms of the debate and creating new land grabs in the name of food security today. So I wanted to offer those two ideas, and to ask for your comments, and hope that some of that can also be brought into the conversation, because we are talking about something that is also a large ecological disaster, and what can we do to reconnect, and what can we do as consumers in addition to academics and activists and analysts.
Let's take one more question and then
Hi, I'm Derek. I'm a student of urban planning and law at Harvard. Kind of following up on that vein of kind of an affection for the land, I wonder, to connect that with some of the remarks that Duncan Kennedy offered, isn't there sort of an assumption in those remarks of a surplus? I mean, is it possible that there's actually not a surplus once we sort of take into account the relations that people have in this slum? And then the question I would pose would actually be to Phil McMichael. What would you say to someone who said that through the industrialization of agriculture, we could sort of create more, we could sort of provide some of that surplus to the sort of small farmers? Is that compelling to create a structure that they can sort of benefit from that arrangement, or what is the answer?
Why don't we take these questions and have some responses and cover it up? Yeah,
All right, on the first one, I was just going to say Lula, whom I'm referring to, Brazil, he actually gave voting cards to the slum dwellers in Sao Paulo and other cities, and that was, there you are. That was a critical aspect. But they gained something. When you say they didn't get anything, in these, they gained, they suddenly became political actors. They mattered a lot, actually. Now, they didn't matter enough that they would get all they needed for life. But I think that the political is a very powerful presence in our humanity. If we, so it is something that doesn't come necessarily in the shape of food or money, but it is something that you're an actor, that you're a maker. I think that matters. And this then brings me, I just respond to whatever, and then right. And this brings me to your fantastic comments. And again, the word consumer gives me so much trouble. I agree, though, with what you're saying, and what I heard, and I thought that's where you were going, maybe with another way, but what you were really putting your finger on was not just j'accuse, but we matter. How do we make? How do we put our foot down? And so I really have gotten, how one goes through phases. And right now, what I find myself saying is we've become consumers of everything, our citizenship, whatever. And we have to become makers. And then I look at some of these shanty towns. They know how to make an economy, they know how to make housing, a working shanty town, because some of them are spaces of misery and illness, so I don't want to romanticize here. So but also in your comment was something about the shrinking space, which can be a global space, but a thin global space, within which we exist. And I certainly see that with my students. Fine, good students at Columbia University, and kind of ignorance that is absolutely stunning. But they know a lot of stuff, but it is a lot of a certain kind of stuff. So we really have an issue of shrinking zones, I just find that quite extraordinary. Now, I grew up in 6 languages in 3 countries, so I have already a very particularly sensitive to all of this. But I do think that is something that is happening, and of course there is a certain kind of literature on the specializing in more and more parts of life. But that does not necessarily have to come along with, so I did really appreciate that comment.
Thank you. I just wanted to comment on two aspects of what's just been raised. And the one is Smita. I think that I also appreciate the turning of the lens, reflecting back onto oneself. And what it raises for me is the question not only of us as consumers and patterns of consumption, but patterns of investment. And I think that the financialization of agriculture and the creation of financial commodities, land as commodity, a financial commodity, is part of this distancing between those who are investing and the actual material base. So I think that questions about where pension funds are sitting, where one's unit trusts are, and the impossibility of actually getting to find out what those things are doing out there. So I think that that's actually an important area for sort of the rendering visible. Yeah, it's one of the invisibilities that is to be challenged. And the second point I can't see where the man was. Oh, you, yes. I didn't get your name, but I think that this issue of where the surplus goes and is there a surplus, and just reflecting on the centrality of the global land grab being in Africa, and being particularly in a context where land is not titled and where customary owners are not recognized as rights holders, and you don't have that clear possibility of leveraging what they would see as the full value of the land. I think that that's really important, because essentially then you see in the capturing of surplus through the acquisition of land very cheaply, or even for free, and often the payment of compensation or rent to state authorities rather than landholders. But I think that one of the so-called IBM models is land for equity, and the provision, the passing up of property in return for equity in these operating enterprises. And I think that it's really worth looking critically at how these are being designed. And I think that that's an important area where the appearance of the sharing of surplus is actually effectively just a dispossession in practice. So thanks for that comment.
Yeah, thanks for those questions and comments. On the consumption issue, I had the same reaction that Ruth had, because to put it quickly, land grabbing is not simply about certain consumption, it's also about financialization, sometimes simply speculation on land. The second issue, which I think is far more significant and fundamental, and I don't know how to change the development-induced displacement idea, but I think there's a really interesting point here, and that is that Arthur Lewis, back in 1954, defined development as a process of acquiring unlimited supplies of labour, and essentially that piece, which he won the Nobel Prize for, I believe, was redefining farming as unlimited supplies of labour. Development is premised on the removal of small farmers from the land in that sense. It's very much ingrained epistemically, but also ingrained ontologically in terms of our own experiences and the way in which we've lost touch with farming and the land. And to me, it's crucially important to reverse that particular epistemology, because what we're finding is that there's a growing international scientific consensus on the capacity of small farming to actually outproduce industrial agriculture, firstly. Secondly, the consensus is also about ecology, it's about soil health, that small farmers who are diverse farmers who are looking after the soil are not using agrochemicals and poisoning the soil. They're using ecological methods to replenish and restore the soil. And they're also preserving biodiversity, hopefully. And finally, emissions reduction. Industrial agriculture is responsible for about a third of global emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. So low input farming of this kind, ecological farming, has tremendous possibility. Now the big issue here, of course, is one of the questions was about industrial agriculture providing a surplus for small farming. The first thing I thought of is we need to talk about subsidies. The subsidies to the energy industry, to agribusiness, to support financialization could all be switched. I mean, in a world in which I would like to live, could all be switched to supporting the rights of small farmers who still exist on the land, and to replenish and regenerate the possibility for them to actually do the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So I think that's really an important point too, and that's why I think that the question of rights is essential. In the first place, of course, one needs to take it further, and I really like Ruth's point about connecting it to political economy, and Duncan's point too about class projects. La Via Campesina refers to industrial agriculture as agriculture without farmers, and I think that says it all. It's agriculture is becoming simply another industrial sector. Value chains is a very good example here, because value chains are being premised on identifying the small farmer as the new object of development. So it sounds all very nice, keeping farmers on the land, but in fact value chains spin webs of extraction around small farmers, put them into debt relationship, and so now they're working for the companies, the input suppliers, the retailers, the processors, etc. And Jan Dahl van der Ploeg has shown in his book on the new peasantries that in fact this is a very extractive relationship, and the value that's being created is being created by the farmers themselves, who are now labourers on their own land. And it's just being extracted. And in fact, the companies that are putting in value chains are raising the money from the local governments, as Ruth kind of implied. And so it's not like the value chain agribusinesses are coming in and providing all of this investment. In fact, what they're doing is setting up the possibility of extracting value from the land. Thank you.
I think I'm curious if there are more questions, so I think I'll just pass. Okay. Please.
It comes right off.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a student in the Department of Urban Planning here at MIT. I'm currently working with a community in Medellin, Colombia. And what's interesting about this community is the farmers are actually coming in droves to the city, and from the city's perspective are the original land grabbers. They're the ones who are sort of squatting informally on settlements. And this poses an interesting question with regards to property rights. From whose perspective are property rights really determined? And I was wondering if either of you could speak to that issue in the context of differing perspectives regarding property rights in this kind of context and situation.
Hi, I'm Ryan Schleif. I work for a human rights organization called the International Accountability Project. And I've really enjoyed this afternoon's conversation. What I think is actually missing though, and when we've talked about like the blue sky of what we are working towards or thinking about, what I feel has been missing is the role of the communities in deciding their own development plans, right? It seems like the commodification of land and many of the topics that we brought up, it's almost a given that these projects are moving in, it's been decided. And even when we talk about development alternatives, it seems that those are what perhaps communities are presenting or that we ourselves are thinking about in contrast to what the governments and corporations are proposing. But I think if we ask many communities that they see the alternative development plans very differently, right? That's actually what the governments and corporations are proposing. So I'd just like to get your thoughts on communities' involvement and where you feel that fits with the ideas you've proposed. Thanks.
Let's take 2 more questions.
Thank you all so much for your presentation. My name is Thea Gelbspan, and I work with ESCRNet, the International Network on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And I've been working fairly intensively over the last few years with social movements based in several parts of the world that have been struggling effectively against forced displacement and evictions resulting from development projects or initiatives, and trying to kind of connect the dots between their own localized struggles and develop more of a shared analysis. 2 of the presentations that I've heard this afternoon have in different ways questioned the extent to which a human rights framework may be a basis for an effective response to this challenge. And I'm really curious to hear a little more about why those of you that have suggested that are saying that. And my bias, just to disclose it, is that I have been someone who's been very supportive of introducing a human rights framework when discussing resistance strategies, when discussing advocacy opportunities, when trying to figure out really who's accountable for these trends that we're watching and how to best empower the people that are directly affected to be able to set the terms over these processes that are affecting their lives. But clearly your skepticism about the usefulness of a human rights framework has to come from somewhere. I'd love to ask you to elaborate, and also if it's the actual human rights framework itself that's causing the question, or if it's more an issue of enforcement, of applicability. I'd just like to hear a little more about that. Thank you so much.
Want to direct to somebody specific?
I know that, Ruth, I think you mentioned something at the end of your presentation conversation about that, as well as with Duncan, you said near the end of your comments.
Okay.
So I'd love to hear particularly from the two of you.
They stand accused.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Murthy. I'm an assistant professor at Suffolk Law School. And my first question actually just dovetails perfectly with what was just asked. Because when we think about a human rights framework, are we thinking about it as a in the streets, human rights-based approach, or are we thinking about it as lawyers tend to think about a human rights framework, which is the state vis-a-vis the individual, and thus many of you have implicated the state in your presentations. And in particular, when you think about the role of private actors, once again, it comes back to the role of the state in regulating. My second question has to do with the larger discourse, because, for example, the conversations about land grabs and food security and biofuels really relate to the sort of larger discourse that's out there around climate change, sustainability, and to what degree do we really need to be engaging with that discourse, because otherwise there's a lot of greenwashing that happens. Thank you.
Do you want to take these? And yeah, okay. Let's we'll maybe very quickly, if you can take just take the last two questions, and then we'll give you a chance, guys, to wrap it up.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. My name is Michael Kane. I'm a tenant organizer from based here in Boston, but with the National Alliance of HUD Tenants, and also I'm a member of the Habitat International Coalition Board. We're going to be organizing something maybe soon. I guess the question is, in light of these comments, what recommendations would you have in terms of strategic demands, the interim demands that we have to face as organizers? Like what do we do? What's our platform, and what kind of tactics would you suggest? I mean, Professor Kennedy's comments kind of went at that, but I was reflecting that if you take that moment of confrontation and then convert it into negotiating a share of the surplus, isn't that what community development corporations have done, and so on? But then when you look at that, it doesn't really go very far, because they very quickly end up identifying with the aggressor, right? And internalizing that capitalist framework and demobilize. And that's been the path. So, I don't know if we can get socialism in one sector. That's the question of what are the implications strategically for what we do as organizers, and what do we demand in an interim way that will build on the movement and keep it going, rather than ending up compromising with the capitalists.
I had a question for Professor McMichael. I'm Karthik. I'm a doctoral student at TUSP. You mentioned Arthur Lewis's paper on the unlimited supplies of labor, but there's nothing in the unlimited supplies of labor that suggests that the displacement of farmers has to be forced. In fact, Arthur Lewis's model makes no assumption of that sort. But really the question is, can capitalist development in third world countries happen without forced displacement of sort of the peasant class, or the sort of the handicraft craft sector? So it seems to me that, so for instance, I was reading India's 1955 plan by P.C. Mahal and Lopez, and in fact the plan is precisely to focus on heavy industry so that they don't displace the local sector, the craft and the peasant sectors. My question to you, is to sort of both, because it seems that both Professor Kennedy and Professor McMichael seem to suggest that there can be capitalist development without forced displacement. In Professor Kennedy's case, the slum dwellers sort of negotiate to extract the surplus, but the very assumption of a surplus seems to suggest that this is all within a capitalist framework. It isn't really outside a capitalist framework. But experience seems to suggest that, in fact, whenever there has been capitalist development, it has been through at least some amount of forced displacement. And I think that's the tension that I've tried to deal with. Thank you.
Okay, let's go on.
Right. On Medellin, let's remember, I know the case quite well. The issue here is that a lot of the people who came, you're right, that the outsiders were seen, and they were often poor people. They were being expelled from rural areas because of the conflict. And Sergio Fajardo, I don't know where the person who asked the question, Sergio Fajardo, you know, the brilliant mayor of Medellin, etc., give me all the full detail. He's now the governor of the state. So that is a very specific case, you know, but you're right. From the perspective of the city dwellers, it is the rural people who are grabbing land, and they're sort of, you know, all that kind of housing that the government provided. That's true. But the question of community, you know, how the community. Community is a pretty ambiguous term in many ways. It could be the neighborhood, it could be a network, you know, that is not necessarily situated in a place. So I'm assuming that you give it a very broad meaning. I think it is critical. And I think that it's very difficult today to activate people, because the sense is very powerful systems, what can we do? We can do. Look what happens in Ukraine. We won't mention Crimea, huh? But that sort of unsettles the whole thing. It is extraordinary when people mobilize how far they can go. And so one of the issues that has been critical in my work is we need certain spaces. So I think of the space of the city as a space where powerlessness can become complex. You don't necessarily get empowered, but in that complexity of your powerlessness, you can actually make a history. And there are many such examples, whereas the same people, you know, I like to sort of compare the same persons on a plantation, their powerlessness is elementary. You do not get to make a history, chances are. So I do think that in our cities especially, I mean there are other spaces as well, but I'm thinking about cities, it is astounding to me that we don't mobilize more around all kinds of issues, from fairly minor issues to rather more, you know, important and consequential issues. There was another question that, oh God, I forgot now. I wanted to address it, but anyhow, I can remember one of those. The human rights, exactly. Right. Now, as you all, well, you not have all, but it is a controversial framework now. You know, there's a whole debate which has some good things and some bad things. My take is that we are all bearers of rights. The human rights framework captures some of that. But I think the more foundational condition is to recognize ourselves as being right-bearing subjects, whether we are citizens or not. Secondly, all immigrants are citizens of some country, you know, if you want to bring in the country dimension. And so for me, the challenge is the human rights instrumentalities are very important. They can make a lot of difference. I admire the people who, you know, spend a lifetime making cases in lawsuits, etc. But it's not enough. I think, I mean, again, in my mind, we need sort of more distributed elements to achieve what are some of the challenges, the dispossessions, the exploitations, the grand larceny on the other side, etc. It's going to take much more than that. But I do think that it is foundational for all of us to understand ourselves as right-bearing subjects, and that it does not simply depend on the state. And so I just see a more distributed condition where multiple forms of enablement, from very elementary to far more complex, from individualized to collective. Let's remember that in many parts of the world, the question of the rights-bearing subject expresses itself in a collective condition. You know, that is what marks you in a way. Anyhow, I'm not going to do another lecture, don't worry.
Actually, contrary to some other people here, I actually think we've spoken very little about the state. And my thinking is that, in fact, what is the condition under which major commodification and alienation is underway, in Africa at least, is one in which the roles of state and private sector have been entrenched in a post-deregulation era, in which actually the state plays major roles in providing direct and mostly indirect subsidies to private actors, to corporations. So the state is there. It's there in many, many ways, and it is investing and subsidizing, but often through major infrastructure projects. In Africa, it's just astonishing to see how, on the one hand, the state is just withdrawn from so many social functions, but now it's a Chinese company that is going to provide the schools and the clinics, and the state will provide the big infrastructure that enables that production system to be profitable. And I think that it's the new Alliance on Food Security and Nutrition, which is the big framing of the G8's mobilization of private finance into African agriculture, is essentially a set of negotiations with African states about the indirect subsidies that will be provided to private capital coming into their countries. And so the lists of commitments that have been released, I think just last week or the week before, the commitments made by all of these African states of which forms of regulation they will remove. And there's strong commonalities. It's the anti-GM, it's the regulation of various market mechanisms, it's taxation systems, it's tariffs, etc. So I think I see the need to be talking more about the state, the African state, and the sort of, somehow neoliberal doesn't quite capture it. I mean, there's been this rolling back, but now we're seeing the re-entry on a different terms, and there's almost a sense of a division of labor among private sector and state in a new configuration that I don't know that we quite have the right terminology for, to come back to it, concern with terminology. But a key issue there is about, as I understand it, the fantastical modernization dreams of African governments and the dreams of the type of modernity that will be brought about through this influx of private investment. As for the human rights framework, I'm surprised that I came across as a skeptic, because I think that the human rights framework is absolutely, here you are. I think that the human rights framework is absolutely necessary, but also entirely inadequate by itself. And so, and perhaps it's because I'm South African, we have a very strong human rights framework, and it's also patently inadequate to guard against growing inequality. And so I see it as one lever, but entirely inadequate by itself, especially when the kinds of mobilization take such very polite forms, not the crude and the violent and the dangerous forms that you're talking about. So I see a lot of mobilization invoking human rights frameworks, but being unwilling to step beyond that realm of polite engagement, which is why it's amazing for me that 4 villages in Tanzania that have lost their land for 80 years, for which the state got compensated, and that land is not being cultivated. That's the worst, that's not development-induced dispossession, it's the worst of all worlds. It's dispossession with no development of any kind. It's not even about adverse incorporation. But actually, literally, the creation of this fiction of a property regime that allocates rights to an American company that is no longer even in the country trumps the historic customary rights of local people who always used that land. That is polite mobilization. So I see that, so that's an example of the human rights framework being necessary but entirely inadequate, and that perhaps it's a new area of thought of how does one think of a human rights framework being invoked in conjunction with something that is violent and rejects the norms of legal conduct. And finally, who are the grabbers in response to the Colombian question, and who defines property rights? Yeah, I think that just thoughts about from our region, one of the big land grabs of the past decade or two has been, of course, the Zimbabwean land grab, a land grab from below. But who defines property rights? In this case, it is a centralized state, and a state that is keen as well to be bringing in major foreign investment. The result of which has been that this land grab from below, the mass occupation of white commercial farms, and quite a dramatic change in agrarian structure in a short space of time,
has given way to a second wave of grabbing from above by state elites and international companies. So it was in fact the destruction of one property regime, white commercial freehold title, the destruction of that in the absence of defined property rights and their legitimacy within the society, that gave way to new corporate waves of land grabs in connivance with the state. So that's just one example of who are the grabbers, that these are such dynamic processes, and perhaps that draws into question my prior assertion that perhaps we're seeing something irreversible. Nothing is irreversible, and certainly the waves of grabbing of land in Africa are anything but irreversible.
Thank you. Well, thanks for those questions. I totally agree with Ruth on the state. My paper, if you get a chance to read it, is really about the state. And I think it's a historical issue because the states that are facilitating this whole process are doing it in large part because they're in debt. And so there's a whole history there of structural adjustment, etc., and the need of states to bring in foreign currency and to give away their land, essentially. So that's really an important issue. The second thing is the strategic demands that somebody brought up, and I would just say there that I think that supporting the agrarian movements is a really critical issue here. And I'm not thinking about the urban so much as the recipient of potentially 1.6 billion people by 2050, 1.6 billion more people. And if you stop and think about what that means and what kind of accommodations have been made to receive these people, then we're facing a huge catastrophe. I mean, that's already in process. So that's a really important issue. So the agrarian movements, for me, are shifting the sense of farmers from historical relics to historical subjects, and that's a really important politics, I think, to support. Raj Patel is in the middle of the beginning, rather, of making a movie that is about narratives, and I think this is another strategic issue that we can face, that we can get behind, and that is to bring out narratives of the kind of activities that small farming communities that are able to actually support themselves, to be resilient, to stabilise rural populations on the land. The social experiments that are going on, even in urban settings, these are all under the radar, and it's really important to bring them out, to show that in fact there is another world out there. This is presumably Saskia's non-X that needs to be brought forward, and so Raj's project, I think, is part of that whole process. The other part of this story, I think, is taking place in the global fora, and of course Olivier is has been very prominent and very significant in this process, in putting forward the idea of agroecology as an alternative to industrial farming, in pushing human rights envelope and so forth. So that's an area, I think, where the food sovereignty movement through the IPC for food sovereignty has actually had an effect in opening up the Committee on World Food Security to the voices and the presence of the agrarian movements and progressive NGOs that support them. So that's the first point. The second thing is the Lewis question. I would say that I was trying to make a linguistic point or an epistemic point about the way in which farming is regarded, and it seems to me that the development narrative stood very much behind Lewis's argument, and that is whether or not farmers are being forced off the land. And we need to remember historically, enclosure had been going on for several centuries, so there was a history of enclosure, expulsion of farmers off the land into cities. Civilization became identified with urbanity, and I'm arguing that we're at a tipping point in the world's history, in the planet's history, where we need to turn that back somehow, because we're not going forward into the future in a way that's sustainable. And that was my whole point about the fourth social time. The development now is about managing the future, not improving on the past. So I don't think capitalist development is the answer. The question that brought that up, I think capitalist development is moribund. In fact, I would argue industrial agriculture is in crisis. And so one of the things that I find inspiring about the social movements on the ground and on the edges of the cities, even in my own hometown Ithaca, where people are actually implicitly anticipating the collapse of industrial agriculture because it won't survive because of energy, toxicity, chemicals, and the rest. So who's going to inherit the earth? Well, hopefully the people who are preparing in the long haul, the transition town movements, all of these kinds of social experiments that are going on that I think provide a good deal of hope.
So I think I'll just try to respond to the human rights question and to the tenant organizing question. So for the tenant organizing question, I think tenant organizing is one of the best things that people can do in the U.S. to fight inequality, social exclusion. It's a distributive tactic, which I think has a lot of potential. I completely agree that there isn't any formula that tenants' rights movements have come up with. The type of analytic that I was suggesting is useful in order to figure out when there is a surplus. And the surplus, by the way, is a purely financial concept. It's not a social concept. It's Hollandian. The economy has no surplus, but there are financial surpluses that are appropriated. So there the idea is it's crucial to understand tenant organizing. I mean, I'm sure you know Mr. King much more about it than I do, but whether the neighborhood is going up or going down, whether people are being squeezed out by rising rents, or whether they're basically experiencing rapid decline of housing conditions as a result of disinvestment, produces completely different appropriate tactics, I would say. So anti-eviction makes total sense in a gentrified neighborhood, but it's not the obviously right strategy in a declining neighborhood. So that's the only kind of thing that I have in mind that I think is useful to understand that. But the human rights thing is really interesting. I guess my idea, I think I was misinterpreted. I'm a reformed rights critic. I was totally endorsing the rights rhetoric as one of the few global rhetorical modes of hegemonic global discourse that overcomes social division. The evocation of the right is a way to overcome religious, racial, ethnic division, get people fired up. However, I'm a rights atheist, so Saskia and I have exactly opposite background subjectivities. I don't experience myself as a person with rights. That's not central to my experience. And I don't experience other people in terms of their rights. The rhetoric doesn't do much for me. I'm rightsishly unmusical, as David said. Religion. It just doesn't sing for me. I don't really know what Saskia means when she says that.
No, but I mean people who are just like immigrants. When you say, oh, immigrants, he's shutting me out. We can put that over later over a drink.
Good for him. Yeah, exactly. So I'm going to be really quick. But I do totally believe in using it as a vehicle. The only other problem is, let's suppose we've now got our rights. We have no idea what to do. So the point of my intervention was simply, okay, rights, we've got the rights, and we've got power. We have a neighborhood organization, which actually can do stuff. What are our rights? Is it a right to be compensated for the old market value of the property that we are going to give up in eviction? It's market value after it's developed, part of the profits that will go to the developer, or is our right to property a social right? It's an economic right, but it's also a social right. So the meaning of the right is the right to some kind of collective organization to manage land. The framework doesn't say anything about that. My only other problem with it is it's a little legalist for my taste, because I think the great thing with human rights workers that I was describing is they aren't conceptualizing what they're doing as lawyers. They're community activists using rights rhetoric. And I think that's totally great. I love them. I think they're kings and queens of the universe. I know that's not enough for a person who really believes in human rights, because it's too cynical.
Okay, on that note, let's continue this conversation outside where there is a reception.
force me. My commitment to try to manage the social has overcome the natural.